Have you ever stopped to think that the conflict between Israel and Iran is not just a political dispute, but a story written thousands of years ago in biblical prophecies? In this video, we will reveal this secret origin that few know about, showing how this battle in the Middle East is linked to divine promises and signs of the times. If you want to understand what really lies behind the news and how it can impact your life, you're in the right place. By watching, you will discover surprising connections between current events, such as the Islamic Revolution, the axis of resistance, and ancient prophecies from Ezekiel and Revelation. Understanding this story not only broadens your knowledge but also strengthens your hope amid the escalation of conflicts, offering a unique perspective on the future ahead. Imagine being able to interpret the news with a prophetic and spiritual insight that few possess. Now tell me, do you feel prepared for what lies ahead? Do you want to understand how the tensions between Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, and Tehran are part of a greater plan? And stay with me, because this revelation might change how you see the world and your role in it. Let's go together on this journey that few dare to tell. And if you enjoy curiosities like these, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any topics like this. The Middle East is like a pressure cooker where the fire never goes out. Every bombing, every missile attack triggers a reaction that only fuels the flame of retaliation. It's not just a territorial dispute. It's a spiritual and ideological conflict spanning Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, Haifa, through the Gaza Strip, Lebanon, Syria, and beyond. Outsiders see a war, but those who live there face a routine marked by fear, hope, and promises yet unfulfilled. Think of the Middle East as a complex chessboard, where the movement of one piece can unleash an unexpected military escalation. This endless cycle is not just a political issue between Israel and Iran. There is a web that includes the United States, Russia, and China, all interested in this strategic region. It's a Cold War in the Middle East, blending nuclear sabotage. Amid this tension arise Shiite militias Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, and Islamic Jihad groups, all armed and focused on Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. To understand this scenario, it's important to see that this crossfire is fueled by a very ancient narrative, intertwined with biblical prophecies and spiritual promises. Indeed, the Middle East has become the stage for a confrontation that goes beyond physical territory. It's a holy war, where the resistance axis, led by Iran, challenges the so-called Little Satan. But this is not only a religious dispute, it is an ideological and cultural conflict that touches the soul of nations. Imagine, for example, the impact of bombings and retaliations not only on infrastructure but on the spirit of the people living the conflict, and how this affects eschatological hope amid the prophecies of Armageddon and the Millennial Kingdom. Anyone who wants to understand this region needs to pay attention to the military escalation that occurs silently behind the scenes. Sabotages at nuclear plants, drone attacks, and cyber attacks that attempt to destabilize critical systems illustrate an invisible and brutal war. Operation Rising Lion, for example, reveals how far Israel is willing to go to contain the advance of Iranian nuclear armament. In response, Iran launches hundreds of missiles against cities like Haifa and Jerusalem, turning the conflict into a real threat not only to the Middle East but to the entire world. For those who follow the news, it is not hard to see how the narrative has become global. The tension between the United States and Iran, the involvement of powers like Russia and China, and the influence of the G7 create a multinational siege around this conflict epicenter. It's a war that transcends physical borders, involving cyber attacks and total surveillance, where ideological propaganda shapes perceptions, while biblical prophecies accompany every step. It feels like we are facing a prophetic clock that never stops ticking. Looking beyond politics, this battle in the Middle East also awakens a profound spiritual question. The conflict is, above all, a confrontation between spiritual heritages, the Abrahamic covenant, God's promises to Israel, and the resistance of Muslim nations led by Iranian Shiites. What is at stake is not only land possession but the fulfillment of biblical prophecies such as those described in Ezekiel 38 and 39, which speak of an invasion by Gog and Magog, with Iran playing a central role in this scenario. Those who understand this see the conflict in a completely different light. And then, amid this tension, the Cold War, the attacks, and the retaliations, the question lingers in the air: what comes next? What does all this mean for the future of Jerusalem and the Middle East? While the fire of the Islamic Revolution burns in the shadows, the Bible already announces a final restoration, an outcome that no one can ignore. And it is precisely this invisible thread between past and future that leads us to the next chapter of this turbulent story. Before the Islamic Revolution of 1979, Iran was a different country from what we know today. Under the rule of Shah Reza Pahlavi, there was a strong Western influence, with open diplomatic relations with the United States and even Israel. This period marked an era of modernization where Tel Aviv and Tehran maintained trade and even military cooperation, something unimaginable for many today. However, this modernization was not accepted by the entire population, especially the Shiites, who viewed this rapid westernization with suspicion. It was as if a country divided between tradition and modernity was living at a crossroads, waiting for a trigger. Historically, Iran is an ancient power. Remember Cyrus the Great. He was the one who freed the Jews from Babylonian captivity, according to the Bible. This places Iran as a key player in the history of salvation, a contact point between divine promise and human politics. But over time, Iran's identity began to redefine itself, especially with the 20th century tensions that deeply affected the Middle East in practice. This means the region has always been a melting pot, where biblical prophecies and political movements walk side by side, even if not always explicit. The Shah sought to turn Iran into a secular power, developing infrastructure, industry, and education. But for many Shiites, this secularization was a betrayal of religious roots. The pressure quietly grew until popular dissatisfaction found a strong voice in Ayatollah. So, while Tel Aviv and Jerusalem carried on with their lives, the streets of Tehran boiled with ideas that would transform not only Iran but the Middle Eastern geopolitical landscape. A practical example. Understanding this dynamic helps decipher why relations today are so tense, as the past shaped the present. Even today, walking through the streets of Iranian cities like Tehran, one can feel this tension between the old and the new, between the history of a Persian empire mentioned in biblical prophecies and the current theocratic regime. It is a duality no one can ignore, especially for those who follow the prophetic clock of Christianism. If you want to learn more, I recommend reading the Persians in the Bible or following analysis about the Abrahamic covenant, which help contextualize this clash between past and modernity. Thus, pre-revolution Iran is an essential chapter to understand what would follow, a radical transformation capable of igniting the entire region. With this foundation, it becomes clearer how the Islamic Revolution was not just a political event but the trigger for the military and spiritual escalation. That brings us to the current conflict. So, do you feel the weight of this story? This leads us directly to the next topic, explaining Iran's complete turn after The Islamic Revolution of 1979 completely changed the game in the Middle East. Led by Ayatollah, this popular revolt was not just a political uprising but a profound transformation that made Iran a Shiite theocratic Islamic republic. This change made Iran break relations with Israel, which until then had discreet diplomatic contacts, and began supporting armed groups against Tel Aviv. Imagine this. What was once friendship turned into fierce rivalry, with Iran positioning itself against the little Satan in a war of retaliations and propaganda. Khomeini's regime not only turned its back on the West, especially the United States, dubbed the Great Satan, but also created a revolutionary ideology aimed at exporting its vision throughout the Middle East. This ideology respects no borders, spreading influence in Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, and Yemen, supporting Shiite militias and strengthening the axis of resistance. It is a strategic game where Iran uses groups like Hezbollah and Hamas to wage an indirect war against Israel, avoiding direct confrontations but escalating military tensions and fear in the region. This proxy war shows how much the 1979 Islamic Revolution was not an isolated event but the start of a conflict with deep spiritual and ideological roots. Even though Hamas is Sunni and Iran Shiite, the union for a common goal, the destruction of Israel, transcends these divisions. It's as if an invisible fire connects these groups, fueled by hatred and the promise of revenge. For practical understanding, it's worth following news about missile attacks in Tel Aviv and bombings hitting Haifa and Jerusalem. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, Khomeini's successor, maintains this hardline stance, reinforcing the rhetoric against Israel and the West. Retaliation is constant, and Iran prepares for a war that many see as prophesied since biblical times. With operations like Israel's Rising Lion and Iran's indirect attacks, the Middle East is a stage for a conflict that does not end on the military field, but also affects psychological, cultural, and spiritual levels. It is a total war where eschatological hope mixes with the harsh reality of Jerusalem's streets. Thus, the Islamic Revolution shaped the modern Middle East, bringing a new dynamic of conflict and resistance. This revolution not only redrew borders but also destinies, fulfilling an important part of the prophetic clock. For the attentive observer, this is only the beginning of a story that will continue to unfold, leading the region to an even greater point of tension. And so we move to the next topic, Iran's role in the indirect war against Israel. Iran chose a strategy blending patience and aggression, funding and arming groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, and Islamic Jihad, creating a fire arc around Israel. This proxy war is not just military but symbolic, showing how the Middle East has turned into a chessboard where Iran moves its pieces remotely. For those studying the conflict, understanding this dynamic is essential to see beyond the direct fights in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. This alliance between Shiites and Sunnis, despite their differences, exemplifies how politics can bend before greater goals, like the destruction of the Little Satan. Iranian militias in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen operate with logistical and military support, spreading missiles and promoting bombings that cause fear and destruction. Those who follow the news know these attacks are part of a cycle of retaliations that has escalated to Cold War levels, involving sabotage and Hezbollah, founded in 1982, is the most expressive force in this resistance axis, equipped with thousands of missiles. Some long-range, this group challenges Israel not only militarily but psychologically, keeping the population on constant alert. Moreover, Iran invests in cultural and psychological warfare, using propaganda to strengthen the narrative against Israel worldwide, influencing everything from social media to NG. It is important to note that this strategy avoids direct confrontation between Iran and Israel, which could trigger a nuclear escalation. Instead, Iran prefers to keep funding proxy groups, while Israel responds with special operations and surgical strikes. For those who want to keep track, studying recent moves like Operation Rising Lion can help understand this silent war involving bombings and constant threats. After all, the Middle East is a cauldron where the fire of war never goes out. Therefore, this indirect war clearly reflects the spiritual and ideological conflict marking the region. The Middle East is at the center of a prophecy about a final battle, a great tribulation, nations rising against Jerusalem. It has a story where past and future meet and demands attention because the prophetic clock never stops ticking. And so, we enter the theme of the nuclear race and the Cold War unfolding in this tense scenario. The threat of Iran's nuclear program has turned the Middle East into a tense chessboard of strategies and counter. Israel, feeling the weight of an existential threat, invests heavily in sabotage, assassinations of scientists, and cyber attacks like the infamous Stuxnet to delay Iran's progress. This shows that the war is not only fought with tanks and missiles, but also in the shadows of digital espionage and nuclear sabotage, where economic and technological control is decisive. On the Iranian side, the response comes through indirect attacks, using its militias and armed groups to pressure Israel on multiple fronts. Bombings, drone launches, and thousands of missiles against Tel Aviv and Jerusalem are part of this escalating military scenario. The tension resembles that classic Cold War, where espionage, toll surveillance, and silent retaliations keep the world in suspense while global powers watch closely. This dynamic reinforces the Middle East's role as the focus of a larger struggle where the United States, Russia, and China are involved, whether supporting, mediating, or manipulating movements. The multinational siege around the conflict reflects not only geopolitical interests, but also an ideological battle mixed with propaganda and global economic control. For those watching, it's clear this is much bigger than a simple regional conflict. Operations like Rising Lion are clear examples of how Israel tries to neutralize the Iranian nuclear threat preemptively, showing its Air Force bombing military and nuclear centers. Meanwhile, Iran intensifies its indirect attacks, maintaining pressure and fear in an escalation that could trigger an open war. The situation is delicate, as any mistake could accelerate the march toward Armageddon, much discussed in biblical prophecies. Thus, this arms race and Cold War in the Middle East are a prelude to greater events that many believe are linked to signs of the end times. The conflict goes beyond the physical and invades the spiritual, prophetic, and technological. And this leads us directly to the current scenario, where tensions reach their most critical point. Let's look at 2025, a year that promises to be decisive. In 2025, the Middle East experiences one of the greatest military escalations in its recent history. Israel launched Operation Rising Lion, deploying over 200 aircraft to bomb strategic targets in Iran, especially nuclear and military centers. In response, Iran fired hundreds of missiles at Tel Aviv, Haifa, and Jerusalem, showing that the conflict has gone beyond the regional sphere, becoming a multinational clash that could drag great powers like Russia and China. Besides direct attacks, militias allied with Iran, such as Hezbollah, Hamas, and groups in Iraq and Yemen, intensified their bombardments against Israel on multiple fronts. It is an almost total siege, putting Jerusalem at the center of a crossfire. This moment reflects the prophetic tension of the Bible, where nations rise against Jerusalem, as described in Zechariah 12 and 14, foreshadowing the arrival of an eschatological outcome. For those who want to understand, it is as if we are living a living page of the scriptures. Meanwhile, the United States, the G7, and the UN call for a ceasefire, but their voices are ignored because the forces on the ground do not want a truce. The risk of direct intervention by Russia or China grows every day, and this could turn the conflict into a global war. Amid this tension, total surveillance, showing that technology is used as a tool for economic control and ideological propaganda. The situation is a mix of a modern Cold War, with espionage and silent retaliations, and an open confrontation, where crossfire destroys cities and haunts families in Jerusalem, Haifa, and Tel Aviv. The population lives under constant threat, while the prophetic clock of the end times seems to tick faster. If before the conflict seemed distant, today it touches people's lives directly, demanding deep attention and understanding. Thus, the current scenario is not just a military issue but the convergence point of biblical prophecies, geopolitical interests, and a spiritual battle that reverberates throughout humanity. The question that remains is, what will be the next step? And it is precisely this question that leads us to the connection between these tensions and ancient biblical prophecies. The biblical prophecies, especially those of Ezekiel 38 and 39, paint an impressive picture of Iran's role, ancient Persia, in a great invasion against Israel. Gog, leader of Magog, gathers forces from countries like Lebanon, Syria, and others in an attack seemingly destined to happen amid this military escalation. The interesting part is that despite the real danger, the outcome will be a divine intervention with earthquakes, fire from heaven, and confusion among armies, showing that the final victory does not depend on weapons but on God's promise. Isaiah 17 also draws attention by prophesying the total destruction of Damascus, Syria's capital, which will cease to be a city and become ruins. This prophecy is a key point for those following Middle Eastern events, as it reflects the region's instability influenced by the axis of resistance and its military. Practically, anyone wanting to grasp the conflict's depth must watch for these signs to not lose the spiritual dimension behind the armed conflicts. In the book of Revelation chapter 16, we find the description of the final battle in the valley of Megiddo. Kings from the east, south, and north join forces against Jerusalem in a war that transcends politics and becomes the culmination of the Great Tribulation. This helps explain why countries like Russia and China are so attentive to the Middle East, as these prophesied movements shape the planet's future. Zechariah chapters 12 and 14 speaks of nations besieging Jerusalem but emphasizes that the Lord will fight for his people. The Mount of Olives will split, opening space for the Messiah to reign over the whole earth. This directly connects with the eschatological hope of the Millennial Kingdom, where peace will be established and divine promises fulfilled. It is a powerful reminder that despite the conflict, a greater plan is underway. Moreover, texts like Daniel 9:27 and 2 Thessalonians to mention a period of false peace, sealed by a world leader, the Antichrist, who will break the agreement in the middle of the tribulation. This explains why, even during ceasefire agreements, tension never completely disappears. All of this reinforces that the Israel-Iran conflict in the Middle East are part of a prophetic clock that advances in preparing the ground for even more impactful events. The signs of the end times appear clearly in the increase of armed conflicts, like what we see today in the Middle East, involving Israel, Iran, and their allies. Beyond the battles, there is the accelerated advancement of technology, especially artificial intelligence, which brings with it the potential for all of this fits into a larger narrative, where ideological propaganda and mass control are tools to prepare the world for a new order. Another striking sign is the growing persecution against Jews and Christians, who face challenges in various regions, including nations that directly oppose Israel and divine promises. This persecution, so prophesied in the Bible, indicates that the Great Tribulation is near. For those who wish to be prepared, understanding these signs is essential, whether through Bible study, history, or analysis of current facts that reflect these realities. The increase in religious tensions, the strengthening of the resistance axis, and the involvement of powers like Russia and China in the Middle East are evidence of the convergence between politics and prophecy. It is as if the global chessboard is being arranged for the fulfillment of the scriptures, with Jerusalem at the epicenter of this dispute. The presence of nuclear weapons and the military escalation only make the need for discernment about the moment we live in more urgent. Meanwhile, the prophetic clock continues its relentless ticking, reminding us that the divine promise is certain, but time is limited. Many ask, are we near Armageddon, the Great Tribulation? The answer may not be clear to all, but the signs point to an inevitable path that unites history, faith, and contemporary reality. This invites each person to reflect deeply on their spiritual position and choices. And so, faced with these signs, eschatological hope gains strength, the certainty that, despite the storm, there will be a final restoration. The Millennial Kingdom, with Jesus Christ reigning in Jerusalem, promises a time of peace and justice that transcends the current conflict. But to understand what is to come, we need to look at the eschatological outcome that awaits humanity, and that is where we go now. The eschatological outcome promises the glorious return of Jesus Christ, an event that will forever change the destiny of humanity. According to biblical prophecies, he will step on the Mount of Olives, which will split open before him, a visible and impactful sign for all. This moment will not be merely symbolic, but the beginning of the end of the conflict that plagues the Middle East, bringing justice and restoration to Jerusalem and the whole world. The final battle preceding the Millennial Kingdom will be devastating but marked by divine intervention. The forces of evil will be defeated not by human military power, but by celestial authority. This means that all the struggle, the nuclear escalation, the bombings, and sabotage will be confronted by a superior power that will establish definitive peace. It is the eschatological hope that strengthens many amid current difficulties.